I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a whole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a whole I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a whole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter, I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an Arctic. I'm a feminine. a Slim Shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an Arctic. I'm a feminine M&M, a Slim Shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man. I'm a feminine M&M, a Slim Shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin. I'm a feminine M&M, a Slim Shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an Arctic pup. I'm a feminine M&M, a Slim Shady lady. I'm a feminine M&M, a Slim Shady lady. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter, I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an Arctic puff and puff. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter, I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an Arctic puff and puffin'. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter, I blow other dudes out of the I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter, I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a feminine. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter, I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like an I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow up. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cop. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow up. I'm a feminine M&M, a slim shady lady, but nice cause I texted Haiti. 90 lady cops in the road and I'm arrested for doing 80. Like Hamlet, all about words, words, words. Divide a hole into thirds, thirds, thirds. I'm a gay sea otter. I blow other dudes out of the water. I'm the man, muffin, diving muffin, cold and fly like...
of insolvency and crisis.
But the two mortgage giants had staunch defenders. Democratic Senator Charles Schumer said, quote, "I think Fannie and Freddie over the years have done an incredibly good job and are an intrinsic part of making America the best housed people in the world. If you look over the last 20 or whatever years, they've done a very, very good job." Senator John McCain co-sponsored legislation pushing for regulation, delivering a speech on the Senate floor in 2006. Quote, "For years I have been concerned about the regulatory structure that governs Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the sheer magnitude of these companies and the role they play in the housing market, the GSEs need to be reformed without delay." That bill made it out of the Senate Banking Committee with a party line vote. All of the Democrats voted against it, but fearing that they didn't have the votes to pass it, Republicans didn't even bring it up on the Senate floor. Senator Obama did not weigh in on that bill.
Now, this is not a right versus left issue alone. Under Bill Clinton, the securitization of low-income mortgages became mandated with 30% as the initial target. Under his administration, this was raised to 50%. Under George W. Bush, it was raised still higher to 55%. Even though the Bush administration pushed for greater regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, pushing for Wall Street and private banking reform in any meaningful way was lacking. There are arguments as to what caused the housing bubble, including what caused it to burst. The economic issues are complicated and include the Federal Reserve, home buyers themselves, many of whom bought property only as an investment while being too eager to take the risks they knew they couldn't afford, real estate agents, mortgage brokers, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. Wall Street firms who bought the risky loans, converted them into bonds which were rubber-stamped with AAA ratings, then passed them on to unsuspecting investors, played a huge role. Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, allowing commercial banks to merge with investment firms, but didn't place any regulatory agencies to oversee them. This allowed banks to become bigger and take greater risks. The government, however, both Republicans and Democrats, placed the ideal of home ownership at the top of their list of priorities. By placing the focus on the social goal of home ownership and putting artificial pressure on a free market system, the checks and balances failed and profiteers were left to run wild. When it comes to the radical left today, pushing for social agendas without asking those three important questions is just as dangerous as ever. Stopping dialogue and using violence on both sides means that we will lose sight of the premise of the original arguments. Whether it's calls for diversity that conflict with their collective goals, calls for equality of outcome without looking at all factors involved, or denying biological differences in the sexes to demand the acceptance of a social agenda. We all have to look at the solutions that are being proposed and ask those three questions. The same radical left that stifles and discourages discussion rarely, if ever, provides details on their own position that provide answers. I'm going to close with a few clips of Barney Frank. The first is from June of 2005, where he was making a speech on the House floor. This is followed by a clip of him speaking at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. on December 11th, 2006.
This is a very important resolution, particularly at this time, because we have, I think, an excessive degree of concern right now about home ownership and its role in the economy. Obviously, speculation is never a good thing. But those who argue that housing prices are now at the point of a bubble seem to me to be missing a very important point. Unlike previous examples we have had, where substantial excessive inflation of prices later caused some problems, we are talking here about an entity, home ownership, homes, where there is not the degree of leverage that we have seen elsewhere. This is not the dot-com situation. We have problems with people having invested in business plans for which there was no reality, and people building fiber optic cable for which there was no need. Homes that are occupied may see an ebb and flow in the price at a certain percentage level, but you're not going to see the collapse that you see when people talk about a bubble. And so those of us on our committee in particular will continue to push for home ownership. We have more to do yet in the deregulation. I'm just saying it. One of the things we did was to try and reduce the reporting requirement from the banks to the financial detectives. and far too much has to be reported now, in my judgment. We weren't doing anything for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, at least most of us. For me, the motivation was housing. We were doing something for housing. And I agreed with those who argued that because of the market's perceptions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac got this great benefit in being able to borrow money cheaply, but that the benefit was not being adequately returned to the public. Now, there were two things you could have done about that. You could have reduced the benefit. You could have cut back on their ability, in effect, to borrow as cheaply. Or you could leave that benefit in place and distribute it more fairly. That's what we chose to do with the Affordable Housing Fund.
In 2007, Barney Frank was the original co-sponsor of the Expanding American Home Ownership Act. This act made further changes to the National Housing Act that lowered standards for home ownership and encouraged people to put themselves in greater and greater risk of default. It extended term mortgages from 35 to 40 years and officially allowed for the borrowing of 100% of the appraised value of the property plus costs with zero down. Links to the full text and summary are in the description. It's important to recognize that housing prices had been dropping for many, many months when this was passed. In 2009, after the crash, Barney Frank is interviewed by Tavis Smiley and says that pretending people can do something they can't is no favor for them, and he states that conservatives wrongfully pushed home ownership on people.
You know, people haven't fully understood. One of the causes of the terrible crisis we had over the last few years, which has given us today's problem, it came from people being pushed into buying houses, taking out loans that they couldn't afford. Part of that was a conservative view that rental housing was a bad thing. I had been trying with a lot of others to try and continue programs to build decent rental housing for people. What we had were people in power who didn't like that, and they said, no, we'll help them become homeowners. Well, people were pushing to home ownership who shouldn't have been there. So what I did today, because we have now in Barack Obama, a president who understands this, that if you are low income in America, if you're poor, you probably are not going to be able to afford a home. You know, people have said to me, well, wouldn't you want to own a home? Sure, I'd like to eat more and not gain weight. But you can't be unrealistic about what's going to happen. And so I met with a group of people today who are very responsible advocates for building decent, affordable rental housing.
But how does that, I hear the point, and I'm glad you're on the case there, Congressman, but how does that ultimately lead to home ownership? Because you can't tell me you want to sell these folks short on the American dream.
Well, it may not lead to home ownership. Yes, I don't want to sell them short. I want to recognize, though, Tavis, that they may come up short. Pretending people can do something they can't do is no favor for them. I wish we could do something about income inequality in America, and I'm for that. I would like to get better education all up and down the social sphere so people can earn more money. I'd like to bring down the cost of housing. But at the point when people are making, frankly, $30,000 or $40,000 a year in much of this country, they're not going to be able to afford a home. And if you pretend that they can, you get them into trouble.
Finally, in 2010, Mr. Frank states that his view has always been that it's a mistake for government to heavily subsidize home ownership.
My own view has always been that it's a mistake for the government heavily to subsidize home ownership, and that we are much better off trying to subsidize rental housing, because when you put people in a decent rental housing, you do not confront the problems that we have seen from putting people inappropriately into home ownership.
I guess that's one way to avoid having to answer any of the 3 questions posed by Dr. Soul. You can always lie and simply state that you never held that idea and never pushed an altruistic goal without regard for any costs. Remember, like and subscribe, but most importantly, leave comments and engage with others. Open discussion is always needed. If you have nothing valid to say,
0 fucks given.
Dr. Thomas Sowell is an economist, a social theorist, a political philosopher, and an author. He's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Although I don't agree with every thought, idea, or argument he has, this is true of almost everyone I show or highlight in my videos. Although most of the videos I show have a conservative slant, they're meant to highlight issues with certain liberal agendas and provide challenges to what the more radical left takes for granted. An article written by Dr. Sowell begins with, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said there were phrases that serve as an excuse for not thinking. One of these phrases that substitute for thought today is one that depicts the current problems of blacks in America as a legacy of slavery. New York Times writer Nicholas Kristof asserts that there is overwhelming evidence that centuries of racial subjugation still shape inequality in the 21st century, and he mentions the lingering effects of slavery. Now, Dr. Sowell goes on to discredit this overwhelming evidence, then continues, if we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with hard evidence on the legacy of liberals.
Well, in 1960, which would be almost 100 years after the end of slavery, 22% of black kids grew up in homes with only one parent.
Just 22%?
Yes.
4 out of 5 were in homes with both parents?
Yes. 30 years later, after the liberal welfare state, that number had more than tripled. And so I said, well, let us compare, if we can speculate on how much that 22% was due to the legacy of slavery. But we know that that tripling was not due to the legacy of slavery. It was due to the legacy of a whole different set of policies. And you can look at it so many other ways. Education. Stuyvesant High School in New York, as you know, you get into only by passing a very tough exam. In 2012, the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School was less than 1/10 of the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School 33 years earlier.
I didn't know that.
There's Dunbar High School in Washington, which was an elite black high school for a very long time. In 1993, the number of kids out of Dunbar High School who went on to college was less than it was 60 years earlier, which would have been in the depth of the Great Depression. And so you can run through a whole bunch of other things like that. Look at the housing projects. The housing projects in the first half of the 20th century, during that first 100 years after slavery, did not have the high crime rates, the murder rates, the graffiti, all the rest of it that we associate. None of that was there. People, like the New York Times, Kristof should read his own old papers, pointed out that on Saturday mornings it was common in the housing project of this earlier era for parents to leave their doors unlocked because some of the parents could afford television, some couldn't. So the ones who had television would leave their doors unlocked, and the kids from the other families could come down there and watch television with them. Well, now the latest figures show that most people below the poverty line have 2 television sets and cable, but they wouldn't dare leave their doors unlocked in a public housing project.
I'm quoting that column again. Liberals have wreaked more havoc on blacks than the supposed legacy of slavery they talk about.
Yes.
You don't mean that hyperbolically.
No, I do not.
You mean it.
Yeah, and another thing, crime and violence. Now we take it for granted that there's tremendous levels of crime and violence in the black community. That was not always the case. In the 20s, it was very common for white celebrities, including George Gershwin and William Faulkner, to go up to Harlem not only for entertainment places, but to go into private homes of people they knew. And Gershwin played Rhapsody in Blue in this home where Walter White lived. Milton Friedman, when he was a graduate student at Columbia, he and the lady he later married would go dancing at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. And he said, we had no fear of being mugged or accosted on the street or anything like that.
I've heard you say, Tom, when you were a boy growing up in Harlem yourself, Your own neighborhood felt totally safe to you.
Not totally safe. I wouldn't exaggerate, but there's nothing resembling today. I mean, I did sleep on hot nights. I would sleep out on the fire escape. When I tell people in Harlem that today, they think I'm from another galaxy, you know. But that people slept on the fire escapes in New York and in the public parks in the 30s, all over the city.
Now, in the full interview, Dr. Sowell talks about the fight for civil rights, Martin Luther King, and how there's a distinction between that cause and the ability to look at the Great Society and examine the damage caused by the imposition of the welfare state. He believes the system in place right now has rewards for staying on welfare, has punishments imposed for trying to work and get off of welfare. The result are the kinds of statistics he originally mentioned. If this system is said to help those in need, then how does one account for the incredible increase in single-parent homes, the reduction of student enrollments in those elite high schools, and the vast increase in the crime rates within African American communities? If the argument is that the welfare system is not connected to those things, it is at least certainly obvious that the system does not help them. At what point do you consider a system a failure? Charles A. Murray is a controversial libertarian conservative who is a critic of the welfare state. A universal basic income has been discussed for the past few years, and here is his plan in very general and broad terms.
The basics are this. At the age of 21, every American who holds a passport which is issued at birth and has the same function as an ordinary passport, but also establishes your eligibility as an American citizen for the Universal Basic Income, UBI, starts to receive a monthly deposit electronically to a known bank account of $13,000 divided by 12. $13,000 is the total basic income, of which $3,000 must be devoted to health care, which I'm going to push aside because it's a complicated additional topic. So you have $10,000 of disposable income that you're getting in monthly allotments. Well, I think that there are all sorts of ways to do that which would cause catastrophe. I think if we simply add that onto the current benefit system, it's not affordable and it also is a catastrophe. But what if it replaces everything else? There's no more Medicare, no more health insurance, Social Security. There's no more welfare. There's no more corporate welfare. There's no more agricultural subsidies. I can go through the whole list of transfers. There's none of that stuff, and there's also none of the bureaucracies that administer it. You have $10,000, and you say, well, you can't live on $10,000. Well, if you really want to live all by yourself, no, you'll live a pretty grubby existence on $10,000. You get a minimum wage job, just a minimum wage job, and you work 2,000 hours a year at, let's say, $750. That's $15,000 plus 10. That's $25,000. Yeah, that's way above the poverty line. Well, suppose for some reason you can't work, or suppose you don't want to work. You can still have a decent existence if you're cooperative. If you're cooperative enough to convince a friend, a girlfriend or boyfriend, a relative or something else to pool your resources, if you just do it with 2 people, you got 20. With no working whatsoever, you got 30 if you got 3 people. You add a little bit of income and you're in the middle class. That $10,000 given to everyone has a huge effect on their ability to live a decent existence by doing reasonable things. But it also has, I think, a couple of other huge advantages, again, because of some features of my specific plan, which I'm quite proud of. One is, right now, we claw back benefits at a very low rate. So that if you're on food stamps and Medicare, and you take a job, you very soon face a very punitive loss of benefits. I say, look, you keep your entire $10,000. We don't claw back a cent of it until you have $30,000 in earned income. Once you have $31,000 in earned income, you'll pay $50 or some very minor clawback, and that'll increase as your income rises. But I'm really saying to somebody who's gotten up to $30,000 of earned income, okay, you now got a net of 40. You really want to quit work and go back to 10? Yeah. I'm luring them in to work until they can't quit. And the other thing that I've really like about it is that it reverses some really terrible incentives. For example, the people who do not work because they're afraid of losing their benefit, that all disappears. They go to work, they're pure profit for them to go to work, whereas now it can be very punitive. The second thing is, consider the classic case of the young woman who has a baby and no husband. Well, it is a statement of fact that under the current system that generates an income stream she would not have otherwise had. I'm not saying she has the baby to get the income stream. I'm saying it does generate an income stream. Under the plan I'm proposing, she has an income stream. The baby is going to be a major drain on that income stream. Now that can also be good. All of us who have children have a major drain on our income streams as a result that we're delighted to have. But it does get the incentives right. I really want a baby. I know I'm going to be paying for diapers and baby food and all that, and I still want the baby. Okay. But if you've got the income stream and you say, gee, do I really want to spend it on those kinds of things? Or do I want to spend it on some more education or better clothes or something? That gets those incentives right.
Now, there are many that oppose the universal basic income concept, arguing that it would be more costly than the welfare system currently in place. This is completely dependent upon how it's implemented, the payment amounts, the income cutoffs, the clawback rates, etc. What cannot be argued, however, is that there is an enormous administrative and bureaucratic cost associated with the welfare system as it currently exists. For every dollar that goes to an individual in need, there are administrative costs that are associated with it. Now, trying to find those costs becomes a huge rabbit hole filled with opinions and agendas. But two things seem pretty clear. The incentives are wrong within the current system, and there is a large bureaucracy in place with thousands of people whose livelihood depends on keeping the status quo. Finland is testing a small version of basic income right now. Maybe the results they get will be the first indicator of the viability of such a program. Remember, like and subscribe, but most importantly, leave comments and engage with others. Open discussion is always needed. If you have nothing valid to say,
Zero fucks given.
I have a couple of clips here with Jordan Peterson and his talk from a couple of weeks ago at Ryerson University. I wanted to start out with a short clip from Steven Pinker, a cognitive scientist, psychologist, linguist, and a popular science author. He is the John Stone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, and I think his point is relevant, as it seems that anyone who advocates for free speech is at times dismissed by some on the left as being right-wing. And what happens is their ideas or opinions are then looked at through a conservative lens, and their message doesn't seem to be getting through all the time.
Disappointing and sad commentary that free speech has gotten the brand of a right-wing issue. Now, why should that be? There's no, by definition, it's just free speech, whether it's from the right or from the left. But people who defend and extol free speech, tend to be branded as right-wingers because of this, I think, what you correctly identify as an ironic intolerance. I sometimes refer to the mythical place called the left pole. Now, just as when you're at the North Pole, all directions are south, the left pole is the mythical spot from which all directions are right. So any opinion that does not conform to this orthodoxy is branded a right-wing opinion, including people who are, by no stretch of the imagination, ideologues of any sort, including right-wing ideologues. So I know that you had recently Christina Hoff Sommers speaking in this this same forum, and she's often branded as someone on the right, even though there's nothing particularly right-wing about her, other than the fact that she disagrees with a particular kind of orthodoxy. So that is, I think, to our shame as academic scholars and professors, that that free speech should itself be politicized when it should be prior to any political discussion in the first place.
All right, and now for the first clip from Dr. Peterson. Somebody in the audience has just asked, would you care to comment on the apparently well-established neo-Marxist idea that men have a common collective interest and that women have a separate common collective interest, and that these interests come into conflict, that there is competition at some sense on a collective level?
I think there is competition between men and women, but it's nested inside a broader arena of cooperation. You know, this is another thing that you learn from reading Piaget, if you're careful, is that because Piaget was smart enough to understand that there is no dichotomous opposition between cooperation and competition. So, you know, one of the sort of tenets of the kind of leftist mumble-jumble that I hate is that kids shouldn't play competitive games, right? It should be cooperative games. It's like, okay, let's take that apart. Let's take hockey. Is it competitive or cooperative? Well, it's competitive. Well, wait a second. No one brings a basketball to the hockey game, right? No one brings a chessboard. Everyone that comes to the hockey game comes there to play hockey. That constitutes cooperation. We'll mutually define the aim, right? This is Piagetian cooperation. We'll mutually define the aim. We'll assign each other roles. We'll all agree to stick to the rules. Well, that's cooperation. And if you break the rules, what happens? You get stuck in the penalty box. You're not playing hockey. Off you go. And people go off. They go sit in the penalty box. They don't go kill the referee with a stick. Like they go and sit in the penalty box. You know, 6'7", 300 pounds. So, okay, and then you think, well, what about within the team? Is that cooperation or competition? Well, each team member is trying to be the best player, but try not passing to your colleagues and see what happens. You know, even if you're really good, you're just a diva, and no one's going to be happy with you. You know, they'll put horrible things in your beer after the game. So it's cooperation there as well. And then there's a meta level of cooperation, which is that everybody's trying to improve their skills simultaneously, and so that serves a higher order good. And everyone's trying to learn how to be a good player so that they can play many games. It's like, well, we shouldn't play competitive games. It's like, you must have been educated at OISE. Sad. It's very sad. And it's so ignorant for people who know something about child development to say something like that. It's just, what is with you? Where were you educated? Or where weren't you educated is the right response. So with men and women, well, there is group competition. For example, you're competing, roughly speaking, with all your classmates, right? And some of the women are going to outshine you. And so that's tough for men. It's particularly tough for men because it isn't obvious how you compete full bore with women. It's not obvious, and we don't know how to solve that problem. And then, of course, status in relationship to the male hierarchy is more important for men than it is for women, because women pick their mates based on their position in the social hierarchy. And so that puts men also in an awkward way. It puts women in an awkward position too. Like a lot of you women, let's say there's a fair number of you here who have an IQ of more than 130, which puts you in like maybe the top, you know, you're 1 in 20, 95th percentile. And then, you know, you've got pretty good career propositions. So like your pool of eligible mates is minuscule. And the data shows that clearly. If I remember correctly, a 15-point increase in IQ for a woman decreases her probability of finding a partner by about 40%. It's something like that. It has zero effect for men, by the way, because men mate across and down dominance hierarchies, not across and up. So if you're a smart woman and you're attractive and you're young and you're hardworking and you have a good career, it's like you need a man who's smart, hardworking, young, who has a good career, but he has to be a little better at those things than you. It's like, good luck. Good luck. It's going to be rough because there just aren't that many people like that. And so there's another problem that faces women too, which is you're not going to be smart, hardworking, with a good career till you're 30. Well, then you have to compete with 25-year-old women. And so that's also an insoluble problem, because the thing about 25-year-old women is they put less stress on men. Why? Why? Because they can have babies for an extra 5 years. So every guy thinks, yeah, I'll have kids sometime. Because he can think that. He can have kids till he's 80. What the hell does he care? Women, no. 35, 40, you better get it together by then. And so when you're 30 and you've got your act together, you've got those 25-year-old women to compete with. And men don't care about your damn status. So it's rough. It's rough. So there is lots of competition between men and women, but it's nested inside a much broader domain of cooperation. Marriage is this fundamental solution to that. And I think the evidence for that is also clear. It's like it's better for women, you have a better sex life, you're healthier, your kids are better off, you're not nearly as likely to plummet into a lower socioeconomic category, which almost always happens to women who get divorced. Because it's hard. You got one income, you got kids, good luck. Like, you're poor. And if you're not, it's because you're working. So often, the only time you have to have a date is with some psychopathic man who's useless and can bend his schedule around yours. Yeah, well, I've seen plenty of this, man. I'm not talking through my hat. I know exactly what the hell happens when you're a little older and a little poorer and a little more desperate. It's not exactly fun. So I wouldn't recommend that you end up there. So.
Okay, on that happy Valentine's Day note.
Jordan Peterson is giving a talk at the National Gallery in Ottawa on March 9th. His talk is about the psychology of creativity and has nothing to do at all with his positions on free speech or political correctness. He was invited well before any of this discussion had even begun. There is a petition to have him disinvited. The organizer of the petition has tweeted out, "If public citizens want to rent space and pay to have a bigot speak, that is their right, but our public money should fund inclusiveness." A CBC News article quotes her as saying, "Art itself has always been, historically, a safe space, a safe place for the queer community, and so when our National Art Gallery is giving space to somebody who is very anti-LGBTQ, then what does that say about our country?" Simply put, Peterson is not anti-LGBTQ. As a psychologist, he has explained that he feels fractioning gender identity choices into so many subcategories can be damaging. But his real issue is that of a government compelling people under threat of force to use language that is not common nor even useful. There are protests planned, and Black Lives Matter apparently knows what to do. In an open letter to the gallery, an artist and educator wrote, "I prize the National Gallery as a space that celebrates creativity, uniqueness, diversity, and progressiveness. I value the gallery as a safe space where works created by a diverse Canada can be seen. This includes, but is not limited to, works by LGBTQ2S+, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Black, and Muslim Canadians. I count on the gallery to expand my own and others' viewpoints, and to never make any members of my community feel unsafe." Perhaps that was a naive expectation. She continues, "The fact that one of Canada's most prized institutions in my home city is providing a forum for a man whose hateful speech hurts myself, those I love, and my community is deeply, deeply disheartening." It's really ironic that Dr. Peterson's concern that his refusal to use an ever-changing subjective list of made-up words could be considered as hate speech was dismissed as fear-mongering. Now, the same people who dismissed his argument are using the words hate and speech to describe what it is that he is doing. Yet he isn't at all. He is providing his point of view while refusing to say words. He is willing to discuss this openly. Here are some comments left on the petition to have him disinvited by people who signed the petition. "Hate speech needs no more support and platforms, especially in the arts where minds are most open. While I believe in free speech, Jordan Peterson's positions on gender naming is hate speech. He is free to believe what he wants, but it should not be without a cost, and should definitely not come with this endorsement. This individual uses free speech to promulgate hate. University of Toronto invited a UBC faculty to debate him, and the hate mails and death threats to her and Professor Kosman continue. He fed the Post a story and wrote to UBC to try to get his UBC opponent fired. His rhetoric is ill-informed and dangerous. Art is about freedom of expression for alternative views. This man uses his standing to incite homophobia and transphobia. It is just disguised bigotry and white male arrogance. He can and must sit down now. He's taken up enough space.
Like, if you're hyper-liberal, you have to talk to the damn conservatives, because sometimes they're right. Sometimes you're right, but sometimes they're right. And so if you don't talk, then the system tilts off to the extreme that's represented by that temperament. And so what you'd have is a bunch of liberals talking about new things while the buildings were falling down around them. So we need each other. And that's, see, part of what's happened in the West is we figured that out a long time ago. We figured out, oh, well, yeah, I've got to talk to those stupid people who don't think the way you do. Because sometimes, despite the fact that they're annoying and nowhere near as smart as you, they're actually correct. And so here's another way of thinking about it. Imagine the environment does this, like a snake. It's always moving, right? You don't know where the damn thing's going. And you want to be in the middle. It's like two cliffs. It keeps shifting. You want to be in the middle, far from the cliffs. It keeps moving around, and you're trying to walk forward. Well, sometimes it's over here, so the conservatives, they have to pull it back. And sometimes it's over here, so the liberals, they have to pull it back. But because it keeps changing, you don't know who's right. And so you have to keep talking. And that's what a democratic society actually allows for. Exchange the opinions, move the damn polity, so that we can stay in the middle of the snake, roughly speaking. And so you got to have some respect for people who aren't like you. They're actually not like you. So I figured out recently, I think, that I couldn't figure out why openness and conscientiousness are the dimensions that are determining political belief, because they're not even correlated. So why the hell do they clump for political belief? And I think I figured it out. I think it's because of borders. I think the fundamental political issue is how open versus closed borders should be. And I don't just mean borders between states. I mean borders between states, I mean borders between institutions, borders between genders, borders between sexes, borders between ideas. The conservatives say, keep everything where it belongs because it's working. And the liberals say, yeah, it's working for now, but unless we make some adjustments, it's not going to keep working. And they're both right. So we better have the dialogue, because otherwise we wander off the cliff, on the left or the right. And we know where that goes. There's flames down at the bottom of those cliffs. And people die horribly down there. And we've seen that on the right and the left. We've had plenty of evidence for that.
Now, it's one thing for a group of people to talk about being open-minded and tolerant while throwing out words like bigot and homophobe. It's another thing to actually be open-minded and be tolerant while throwing out ideas like we need each other, and that's what we do in a democratic society. The crazies are living at the left pole, and to them all directions lead to the right. They're too stubborn in their ideology to even see another point of view without defining it as wrong and extremely conservative. And that doesn't help anyone. If you like the video, smash that like button. If you don't like it, leave a comment explaining why. If you have nothing to add,
zero fucks given.
So I've been talking about your cause, I guess, since you started your videos and since you started having troubles with, with human rights tribunals or threats by U of T. And I just think it's common sense, as I said, that I think that promoting critical thinking, helping people to be able to tolerate subjects that they may not feel comfortable about, but that they should be able to hear and process, not based on emotions, but based on an actual analysis of the facts, the evidence, the reality, versus some agenda being shoved down their throat, whether it's through the media, through the professors, and anyone teaching in academia knows that there are professors who have no problem with basically teaching their truths as fact. And so I've been promoting this, I've been promoting it within my own organization, the Ontario Psychological Association. I got a lot of flack from other psychologists who thought, no, we can't allow.
Well, welcome to the first edition of Under the Radar, where I attempt to bring you stories that you may have missed during the week because you're all such hard-working individuals with better things to do. So let's just dive straight in with the first story. Left-wing Dutch vegan who moved to Switzerland is denied a Swiss passport because she's too annoying. Oh, sweet justice. Now, if you've ever met one of those militant vegans, then you probably don't need any further explanation of why people don't want her around. But let's see why she was officially denied a passport. A left-wing Dutch vegan who campaigned against cowbells in the Swiss village where she lives has had a request for a Swiss passport thrown out after annoying the locals. Nancy Holten, who was born in the Netherlands but moved to Switzerland at the age of 8, is a fluent speaker of Swiss, German, and has children who are Swiss nationals. And she wanted a Swiss passport herself, but was refused after locals who were consulted about her request said they were fed up of her challenging Swiss traditions by campaigning against the use of cowbells. The campaign against cowbells by the 42-year-old vegan and animal rights activist has made her unpopular in the Alpine Confederation. Of course, it should go without saying that if you're a vegan, you're almost certainly going to be an animal rights activist. And I think Dr. Randamacam had some words of wisdom for the more extreme types during a recent tweet storm. Exactly. And now the majority of residents from Gipf Oberfrick in the canton of Aargau have successfully blocked her second attempt to get a Swiss passport. The Residents' Committee argued that if she does not accept Swiss traditions and the Swiss way of life, she should not be able to become an official national. Local politician Tanya Suter agreed with the majority of the town's citizens and said Holten had a big mouth, saying she did not deserve to get a Swiss passport if she irritates us and does not respect our traditions. I can think of a few other nations that could take a leaf out of Switzerland's book when it comes to immigration policies. The case has now been transferred to the cantonal government in Aargau, which can overrule the decision and still grant her a Swiss passport despite the objections of the locals. Local residents in Switzerland often have a say in citizenship applications, which are decided by the cantons and towns where the applicants live, rather than the federal government. I bet there are some towns in France and Germany that wish they had a say in who can and can't reside there. So whilst we're on the theme of annoying women, Women's March on Washington opens contentious dialogues about race. Now this is from the New York Times, so they take a slightly different angle than the one I'm going to take. Many thousands of women are expected to converge on the nation's capital for the Women's March on Washington the day after Donald J. Trump's inauguration. Jennifer Willis no longer plans to be one of them. Ms. Willis, a 50-year-old wedding minister from South Carolina, had looked forward to taking her daughters to the march. Then she read a post on the Facebook page for the march that made her feel unwelcome because she is white. The post, written by a black activist, does that make her a blacktivist? From Brooklyn, who is a march volunteer, advised white allies to listen more and talk less. It also chided those who it said were only now waking up to racism because of the election. You don't just get to join because now you're scared too, read the post. I was born scared. Now, you won't find a better example of the toxicity of identity politics. Basically, this is a my oppression is worse than your oppression because intersectionality argument. You're an oppressed woman, but I'm an oppressed black woman. Oh, Jesus. Stung by the tone, Ms. Willis cancelled her trip. This is a women's march, she said. We're supposed to be allies in equal pay, marriage, adoption. Why is it now about white women don't understand black women? Well, putting aside the fact that the causes around which you are supposed to be allied are bullshit, you, Ms. Willis, obviously haven't been paying attention. It's all about where you are on the oppression stack and acknowledging your privilege according to the theory of intersectionality. Now, I'm not going to go into intersectionality, but I will play a clip from Christina Hoff Sommers about what intersectionality can lead to.
Victimization confers wisdom, moral authority, even prestige. So in places where intersectionalists gather, on campuses and social media, there's now a mad scramble for victim status. Now, I first saw this theory in action way back in 1992 at the annual meeting of the National Women's Studies Association in Austin, Texas. Now, the conference organizers had imbibed the lessons of intersectional feminism, and they were struggling to honor all identities. So the participants were told to assemble in small groups based on their healing needs. So there were groups for Asian women, African American women, elderly women, Jewish women, disabled women, fat women. None of these groups proved stable. Fat group polarized into gay and straight factions. Members of the black lesbian group could not get along. Those who had white partners were called out for their privilege and had to form a separate group. And new identities emerged. A group of women with allergies formed a caucus and issued a set of demands about not wearing dry-cleaned clothing or hairspray. It was a conference of scholars, but we didn't resolve our differences through rational discussion. Instead, intersectionality created new reasons for anger and devoured itself. The conference ended with songs and healing rituals.
I think I'm going to need a healing ritual after that. And I encourage you to watch Christina Hofsommer's full video on intersectionality, linked below. Now, since it's only one day after the inauguration of President Trump, I thought this story would be very fitting. The Clinton Foundation shuts down Clinton Global Initiative. Ah, yes. The Clinton Foundation's long list of wealthy donors and foreign government contributors during the 2016 elections provoked critics to allege conflicts of interest. Clinton's partisans defended the organization's charitable work and dismissed claims that it served as a means for the Clintons to sell off access, market themselves on the paid speech circuit, and elevate their brand as Hillary Clinton campaigned for the presidency. I mean, why would they do that? That's just crazy talk. But as soon as Clinton lost the election, many of the criticisms directed toward the Clinton Foundation were reaffirmed. Foreign governments began pulling out of annual donations, signaling the organization's clout was predicated on donor access to the Clintons rather than its philanthropic work. In November, the Australian government confirmed it has not renewed any of its partnerships with the scandal-plagued Clinton Foundation, effectively ending 10 years of taxpayer-funded contributions worth more than $88 million. And yes, who benefited most from that? Julia Gillard. The government of Norway also drastically reduced their annual donations, which reached $20 million a year in 2015. And there's not really much to say other than that, is there? If a big part of the Clinton Foundation wasn't predicated on pay for play, then why are donations drying up? Actually, sorry, there is one more thing to say about this. That's better. Now, speaking of Trump, the next story involves his Education Secretary designate Betsy DeVos, who was asked in her confirmation hearing by Bob Casey whether she would uphold the Education Department's 2011 Dear Colleague letter regarding campus sexual assault, and also threw in the now universally debunked 1 in 5 statistic just for good measure. The Dear Colleague letter, you may recall, required colleges to use a lower standard of proof when adjudicating sexual assault cases. Now, as most of the potential appointees are in these hearings, they try to be very measured in their responses. But I think DeVos's response should be seen as offering a glimmer of hope when she said, quote, "If confirmed, I look forward to understanding the past actions and the current situation better, and to ensuring that the intent of the law is actually carried out in a way that recognises both the victim, the rights of the victims, as well as those who are accused," she said. So as the story noted, that's about as close to a defence of civil rights for accused students as DeVos could probably give in that setting. Just mentioning the rights of the accused is a move in the right direction. And the next story should give you even more hope about the state of college campuses. An Emory College professor is calling for abandonment of the term microaggression and a moratorium on microaggression training programs in a new research study. Scott Lilienfeld argues that none of the 5 core premises underlying microaggression theory are supported by research, and concludes that the concept could end up doing more harm than good. The peer-reviewed study by psychology professor Scott O. Lilienfeld, titled "Microaggression Strong Claims Inadequate Evidence," was published earlier this week in the journal Perspectives on Psychological Science. One of the core premises of microaggression theory, for example, is the idea that unintentional slights exert an adverse impact on recipients' mental health. but Lilienfeld argues that it is premature to advocate strong causal assertions regarding the ties between microaggressions and mental health, because research into that question has historically neglected the impact of confounding factors. Lilienfeld also called into question the belief that microaggressions are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. There is no systematic research support for this hypothesis, he points out. Microaggression theory largely overlooks the possibility, indeed the probability, that individual differences colour recipients' interpretations of and reactions to microaggressions. Yes, so instead of treating minority groups as some kind of hive mind, how about we recognise that everyone is different and that what triggers some special snowflake can be seen as completely trivial to others in the same group? Additionally, despite the belief that microaggressions reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives, Lilienfeld counters that there's no evidence that microaggressions are correlated with indicators of either prejudice or aggression in deliverers. Lilienfeld told Campus Reform that he became interested in microaggressions after he discovered that some colleges were telling students that statements such as, "I believe that America is the land of opportunity, and I believe that the most qualified person should get the job," constituted microaggressions. And this is the way that academics, like those that have joined Jonathan Haidt's Heterodox Academy, have to attack this stupidity, because most of it is just asserted, and then you are shouted down if you don't agree with it, because they know it's not defensible by evidence-based argument. Now, I thought I'd finish off with a clip from that same Betsy DeVos confirmation hearing I mentioned before. This really should be going viral as the ultimate way to shut down socialist loon bags.
Will you work with me and others to make public colleges and universities tuition-free through federal and state efforts?
Well, Senator, I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's really great to consider and think about. But I think we also have to consider the fact that there's nothing in life that's truly free.
So let me know what you thought of the first edition of Under the Radar in the comments. I know it was a little US-centric, but it was the week of the inauguration after all. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you feel especially generous, consider supporting me on Patreon. See you next time. Welcome to the This edition of Under the Radar for Saturday, February 4th. And let's just go straight to the lunacy that happened on US college campuses this week. So I'm sure by now you're familiar with the riot at UC Berkeley that resulted in the cancellation of a speech from Milo Yiannopoulos. So I'm not going to go over the details except to say that the protest turned violent and resulted in a light tower being destroyed and set on fire and broken windows in the Amazon store in the Martin Luther King Center. Ironically, the philosophy of that building being one of non-violent resistance. Now, Berkeley is celebrated as the birthplace of the free speech movement back in the 1960s, and the university in fact stood by that commitment and decided to allow the speech over the objections of 12 members of the faculty who wrote a letter to Berkeley Chancellor Nicholas Dirks asking him to cancel the event. But what I want to focus on here is some of the more remarkable reporting on this incident. From Newsweek, Milo Yiannopoulos gets schooled at Berkeley. Ferocious protests greet right-wing provocateur. Ferocious protests, I guess that's what you call a riot without calling it a riot. On Wednesday night, several hundred people decided the University of California at Berkeley would reclaim its reputation as a crucible of radical activism. They did so in a fiery, violent protest against right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, whose dangerous faggot tour had drawn protests around the country. At the University of Washington in Seattle, a gunman sympathetic to Yiannopoulos' abrasive brand of conservatism opened fire, hitting a protester in the abdomen. Undaunted, the 33-year-old gay Brit went on barnstorming college campuses. Yeah, so some guy just opened fire at the University of Washington. Now, as far as I'm aware, the shooter at the Uni of Washington was not arrested, which would seem odd if he just opened fire on a crowd. And he's claimed self-defense, and the victim of the shooting is not even looking to escalate the situation. Yet in the place sometimes known as Berserkerly, he appeared to have miscalculated the ferocity of the resistance he'd face. Berkeley was to be the last stop on the dangerous faggot tour, in which Yiannopoulos, an editor at the white nationalist website Breitbart, goes through all the far-right complaints and nostrums one might find at a Trump rally, only delivered in a British accent. So there you have it, 2 paragraphs in, and he's been smeared as promoting violence, and now he's a white nationalist. Protesters made sure that didn't happen at Berkeley. Geez, the author is really proud of these scumbags. Gathered at Sproul Plaza, where the free speech movement began in 1964, they succeeded in getting the event cancelled with a sustained demonstration that began several hours before its scheduled 8 p.m. start. Do you not see the irony, you idiots? You're gloating about the fact that you got a speech shut down in the home of free speech. Talk about cognitive dissonance. Now, apart from the violence on campus, a Walgreens was tagged with graffiti, including one that said, "Kill Trump." Protesters posed happily in front of it for pictures. Several bank branches were severely vandalized in downtown Berkeley, including a Wells Fargo outlet, whose ATMs were defaced with Soviet hammer and sickle graffiti, and a Bank of America whose glass doors were shattered with a concrete garbage pail. Nearby, a fire burned on Shattuck Avenue. Attempts to put it out were ineffectual, and closer to campus, a Starbucks outlet came under particularly heavy assault. Now, it should be mentioned that not all the protesters agreed with or participated in the violence, but perhaps the response from President Trump is the appropriate one. Staying with university lunacy, Pennsylvania colleges, reverse racism does not actually exist. Now, you remember last week I featured feminist idiot Louise O'Neill, who said you can't be sexist towards men because reasons. And as I said then, I agree that reverse racism or reverse sexism doesn't exist. Racism is racism, no matter the identity of the perpetrator or the victim. A guide on allyship and anti-oppression produced by Haverford, Swarthmore and Burn Moor colleges declares that reverse racism cannot exist. The guide also covers the concept of microaggression, microassault, micro insult and micro-invalidation. They just keep coming up with more bullshit words, don't they? A tri-college coalition in Pennsylvania has published a resource guide on allyship and anti-oppression that brazenly affirms people of colour cannot be racist towards white people. The guide, made available for students attending Haverford, Swarthmore and Burnmore colleges, provides a seemingly exhaustive list of terms on the topic, including reverse racism, which it then contests is not actually existent. Reverse racism does not actually exist because racism is a structure and people of colour do not structurally oppress white people, the guide argues, making a fine distinction between racism and discrimination, the latter of which can be directed at white people. Well, isn't that convenient? Through your arbitrary redefinition, you've now created your own structures in which you can be racist. You see, I can make shit up too. This is easy. And that's the point. This is just truth by assertion. But I'm sorry, you don't get to redefine what racism is just because it suits your particular ideology. And as I said, gives you carte blanche to be as overtly racist as you like. Sorry, that shit is not going to fly. But the bigger gem here is the definition of gender, which according to the resource guide is a repetitive performance of gendered symbols that becomes a coherent identity, noting that since it is performative, it therefore gives space for alternative iterations of gender. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, exactly what Jordan Peterson called it last year. Fashion. Now, lest you think you're safe from the creeping culture of political correctness because you don't go to college, think again. Don't call pregnant women expectant mothers, as it might offend transgender people, BMA says. The British Medical Association has said pregnant women should not be called expectant mothers, as it could offend transgender people. Instead, they should call them pregnant people, so as not to upset intersex and transgender men, the union has said. The advice comes in an internal document to staff outlining a raft of common phrases that should be avoided for fear of causing offence. The elderly should be referred to as older people, disabled lifts called accessible lifts, and someone who is biologically male or female should be called assigned male or female. The BMA said the document was purely guidance for its staff on effective communication within the workplace, not advice to its 156,000 doctor members on how to deal with patients. Have you noticed how they all say this? Oh, it's just guidance, it's not compulsory. No, but you will be demonised and persecuted if you don't conform. But it gets better. The guide also advises against using the terms born man or born woman in relation to trans people, as these phrases are reductive and oversimplifying a complex subject. Well, that's true. Mental illness can be a complex subject. Elsewhere, staff are told to substitute the words surname or last name for family name. Mankind and manpower should be avoided because it is not good practice to use a masculine noun. Instead, swap for humanity and personnel. And listing prefixes for names such as Professor, Doctor, Mr., Mrs. or Miss should not be put in a particular order on forms to avoid a perceived hierarchy. I had to stop at least twice to check that this wasn't an Onion article. And I know it's cliche to say at this point, but I doubt George Orwell could have foreseen this level of language policing. And what would Under the Radar be without reference to some women's issues? Girls Allowed. Why women-only co-working spaces are the latest office trend.
Oh, Jesus!
I thought using the word girls to refer to women was demeaning. I mean, this is getting very confusing. How would you like to work with 0 men? Now, just imagine the backlash if you saw a headline saying, how would you like to work with 0 women? And then think about the huge number of men that would put their hand up and say, fuck yes. Part of the purpose of these female-only spaces is to allow women to work and network away from the frustrations of a male-dominated office culture. Women are craving community, connection and confidence, and that's what we're going to give them, Stacey Taubman, 38, tells Bloomberg. Taubman is the founder of Rise Collaborative, a co-working space set to open in St. Louis in January. Members will be offered networking events, a book club, and the chance to get involved with mentoring teenagers. So how does this fit in with the diversity mantra when you're excluding one half of the population? Not surprisingly, the article doesn't address that. And of course, you have to ask the question, if men-only spaces were opening up, whether that would survive scrutiny. I have my doubts. And given the complaints about sexist air conditioning or the fact that some women might overhear a comment that she finds offensive in the office, I'm sure a lot of men would appreciate having the language and behaviour police off their backs as well. So I have to be honest here and say, as long as men are granted the same freedom of association, I don't have a problem with it. The type of women that want to self-segregate are probably the biggest pains in the ass anyway. So I say, let them. And for the final story, here's a blast from the past. Remember old Clock Boy? Well, it seems he's had his clock well and truly cleaned. So just to remind everyone, in September 2015, 14-year-old Ahmed Muhammad claimed to have built a homemade clock and brought it to school to show his teachers. One of the teachers freaked out, thinking it was a bomb, confiscated it and reported him to the principal, who then called the police, and they took Clockboy away in handcuffs to a juvenile detention centre. Later it was determined that Clockboy had no malicious intent and he wasn't charged, and then the teachers in the school were accused of overreacting and Islamophobia. So in one of his biggest acts of virtue signalling, Obama invited Clockboy to the White House, where there was a press conference, photos with astronauts, and Obama said that America should inspire more kids like Clockboy to enjoy science. But it turns out Clockboy was no genius, and in fact all he did was take the cover off an existing clock and transplanted it into a pencil box.
This is the photograph of the device that he created or put in here. And what this is a commercial alarm clock, as you would purchase in any department store and use at your bedside. And all that he did was remove the plastic case from the alarm clock. This is not an invention. This is not something that someone built or even assembled.
Now, there are all kinds of claims about this being a deliberate hoax. His father was a nutter, that his family put him up to it. It doesn't really matter. What matters is